So Mikkel Pates covered all of these stories, and you have affectionately called these the bad boys of ag. But what surprised you the most about all of these stories and these criminals?
Well, some of it is just, the audacity of the people that are doing it. In the Hennessy story over in Minnesota, the idea that you could take this amount of money out of your own co-op and spend it so blatantly for yourself on such sort of extravagances as safaris worldwide was a real surprise. I'm 63, and I thought maybe you've heard most of the things that you could have heard about across the years, and this just absolutely floored me. And then, so the bulk of the story occurred in 2018, but in 2019, the guy was sentenced, and we learned more of the details about his matters, including the fact that he spent $500,000 on taxidermy alone to, make his Garage Mahal unprecedented in North Dakota, in Minnesota. So he was off the charts.
Especially with like the Hunter Hansen case, it seemed like the ease in which they were able to do this was almost mind-boggling.
Yeah, here you have somebody who's 21, has no real experience in the grain industry, has no financing, and was able to just drive a truck through the whole system regulatory wise. And it made legislators so mad that they took the grain regulation away from the Public Service Commission, maybe rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly in a sense, because the PSC just dealt with their rules and regulations as the legislature has written them. But they put it in the Ag Department, and that's where it is in other states. So it's going through a complete revamp, and this is having reverberations in Minnesota. South Dakota is looking at its regulation and watching what's going on in North Dakota. Some of the issues have to do with whether you have farmers indemnify themselves with a little checkoff and then protect themselves. And North Dakota has that kind of a fund from a previous disaster, and other states don't. And so you have lots of questions about how to make the system, idiot-proof or, fraud-proof. It's really hard to do because the whole system is based on trust and how people, make deals that are, mutually beneficial and sometimes not so secure. You go on a handshake and that may not be good enough anymore. Maybe it was in the 50s and the 60s and 70s,
right.
But the numbers are too big now to do it that way.
The other thing that producers said to me that read your story was that they thought maybe the sentences on especially Hennessy and Hansen were almost a little too lenient for what they did.
Well, and that's a case, again, of, federal guidelines put certain parameters in for how many times the person's been in trouble before. So if you have somebody that's never done anything, they're going to have fit in the federal guidelines. And so the judge has that range of their sentence, and if they go too high, the prosecution will, if they go too low, the prosecution will appeal. If it goes too high, the defendant will appeal.
The other thing that was interesting, and I know Rose and Katie and I all talked about this many times, is here you have a 21-year-old Hunter Hansen. How does somebody of that age actually do something like that?
Every time the story comes up, I mention this. He's a little younger than my kids, and I just think, how did he pull this off?
Yeah.
And then secondarily, how is he going to repay $11 million restitution?
Well, and that's part of the problem. He probably is never going to have to pay it off or will be able to.
Well, the fact is he'll have this on his record forever, and whatever he earns in any market will have to go into this until that restitution is gone. But the fact is people will probably not get that money. And, but that too is part of the package that, when he pled guilty, that's what he agreed to do.
We've also talked about some of the other scandals and how producers should protect themselves. And I know, Jenny, you did some stories about cattle fraud and how producers can protect themselves from that, right?
Yeah, at the North Dakota Stockmen's Association convention this year, they talked a lot about that because we've had not just these big cases, but just cases where people have some misunderstandings about whose responsibility is what. And they said we really need to move away in agriculture from these handshake deals. We can't rely on people to do the right thing, and maybe we never could, but it's really coming home right now that everything needs to be in writing. You need to know who you're dealing with. You need to be able to go to their banker, go to their lawyer, and have some assurances of who you're doing business with.
Well, and Katie, it kind of speaks to how trusting we are as farmers, don't you think?
We all trust one another, and agriculture is rooted in trusting one another and knowing each other. So in the example of Hunter Hansen, I'm a mother of a son of the same age, and he's just learned to pay his car insurance and his cell phone bill. And I can't imagine running the operation that Hansen did, but he was a local kid that other farmers trusted, and ultimately ultimately livelihoods and farms have been destroyed or financially impacted for generations.
Yeah. So Jonathan, you keep shaking your head. You agree with all of us on that.
Yeah, and especially with Hunter Hansen, obviously a very talented young man. And I sometimes think if only he could have used his undeniable talents and gifts in a positive way, he could have been successful in life. Yet now he ends up hurting himself and hurts many other people. Yeah. So it really is a tragedy.
Yeah, it's amazing to me with the regulations that we have, especially in the futures trading business, that there wasn't more red flags that were popped up for Hunter Hansen.
Yeah, well, it's a classic Ponzi scheme where you start with very small transactions. He was working with a broker who people had worked with for 15 years. And so when they dealt with the broker, they didn't realize they were dealing with Hunter Hansen. And then it just sort of snowballed. If you have several smaller deals that work, then you're not prepared for the big deal that doesn't work because you've been set up. And one of the questions with Hunter that I think is still unanswered is, when did he realize he was a criminal? When did he actually realize that now I'm defrauding people to the tune of 6 or 7 figures? Because some very experienced people in the grain business were taken for millions.
Well, I've wondered if the poor ag economy exposed some of this, that perhaps they could have gone on longer, and when times were good, they could move their Ponzi scheme forward, and as prices dropped, some of them got caught. I don't know if that's a contributing factor.
I would say that the farmers that got caught in it were in a period where they were not making as much money on their grain, and so when somebody offers you a premium and that they'll pick it up and do the trucking for free, and you need to get that bin empty so that you can put the next crop into it, the very fact of the low performing farm economy helped fuel
perpetuated
Hunter's success in this area.
Okay, the last thing I want to leave with is the fact that
I would just like to make one little quick thing later. I once talked with a man who worked in egg sales and who earlier in life had worked in military intelligence. And he told me he was very complimentary of Mikkel's skills as an investigative journalist. And he also told me, wow, Mikkel would have been just outstanding in military intelligence. And I said we're very glad to have him in egg journalism.
The last thing I wanted to wrap up with is the fact that we have talked many times as a group here and as a team that we cannot believe some of the things that you had to do and risk your life at to try to get these stories, Mikkel.
Risk my life?
I think so.
Risk arrest or...
Well, there have been points where I attempted to interview someone who had agreed to an interview in the Hennessy case, where I showed up for the interview even though the man's wife had told me that in a phone message that I wasn't going to be able to talk to him, and I was knocking on on the business door, trying to get them to respond to the door, and they instead called the police. So I had to explain to the Burnsville Police Department that it must be a slow day if they're trying to remove someone from a public parking place. But it's been an interesting thing, and I guess the thing that I always remember about it, even though it's interesting to do it, and it's interesting to think about how it was done, but I've said I would trade every byline if even one of the people could be made financially whole. Yep.
Well, we're all reporters here, and our hats off to you because it was some really good reporting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.